Ane, bonjour. My name is Dominic Beaudry. I'm from the Wakumakong First Nation. I'm an educator. Speak a little bit about education and best practices. When we educate students in our classrooms and in our schools, we want to ensure that education is relevant, and we want to make sure that the education is engaging. One way to make it relevant is to ensure that the students see themselves as First Nations, Métis or Inuit in the daily lesson planning. They should be covered in the content, and it should reflect them in a positive way. That's one way to make education relevant. And to make it engaging is we need to really pique their interests in terms of what it is that they want to learn. Today, education is kind of like transformed itself into, rather than having a teacher teach the students, an education system is now the teacher is a co-facilitator of learning. And if there's 20 students in the classroom or 25 students in the classroom, we have 25 or 20 co-facilitators of learning. So students take a lead role in their learning, and that's the best way to make education engaging for students. Students will have a diverse area of interests. Some of them will be interested in athletics, some of them will be interested in science, technology, whatever it may be. That's the kind of learning that we want to ensure that the students, that's the kind of lessons we want to ensure that the students, to ensure that the learning is relevant. So when we look at education, we need to make sure that that the students take a lead role, and that education has to be reflective of the community that they live in. I'll give you a good example. Years ago, when I taught, well, first of all, I should say that in the past I've been a grade 4 teacher. I've also been a high school history and geography teacher, high school principal, and education director. But when I reflect back on my practice, when you look at students, for instance, in grade 4, we wanted to ensure that students take a keen interest in their education and their learning. So, for instance, if we're looking at science, or we're looking at things that are going to interest them in the classroom, we kind of looked at outdoor education and how to utilize the environment that they lived in terms of assisting them with textbook learning. Again, that's to make it relevant. Then later, when I became a high school geography teacher, one of the things when we looked at, say, soil erosion or river systems or waterways, if you're going to teach students about that, environmental science or geography, yes, they're going to read about it in the textbooks, but one of our practices is to actually take them out in the community and look at soil erosion by a river or by a creek, and see how water over time can be a very powerful force, and it could cause the land to erode. One of the courses I taught as well is environmental science, environmental studies, and we looked at fish farming. So the students researched a lot about the fish farming through online research through the library, and then I was able to connect with Buzwa Fisheries, Ben Kanaswe, and he was able to co-facilitate some of the exercises in learning. So he gave, he invited our students. We had about 25 students, and we went to the fish farms and we looked at the fish. We had rainbow trout at the time. We looked at the tanks, how much tanks he had, and how much fish that he had, and how much feed that he used to take care of the fish. So again, when you look at environmental science, and when you look at fishing in general, again, there's changes in the way people have fished in the past, where First Nations tended to fish out in the open water, but because of the overexploitation of fish and overexploitation of natural resource, again, First Nations have been able to adapt, and they've created fish farms in order to be part of the economic process, in order to be part of the economy. So in Wacomican, there's actually two fish farming businesses now. So we were able to visit the one in Buzzwa and get a closer look. And again, it made the education more meaningful for the students, where we looked at how the fishing economy used to be to how the fishing economy is now, and how Indigenous people and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people can transform their livelihood into the modern context, right? So we were able to take our students, and they learned so much, right down to how much pounds they were receiving for the fish, and some of their connections with the supermarkets in the urban centers, so that way they could sell their fish to the best markets possible. And again, our students were able to use science and math and environmental science to get a better understanding of fish farming as a business enterprise, and as well as fish farming as an economy that kind of changed because society has changed. And I think that's a great way to ensure learning is engaging, to ensure learning is relevant, because this industry is right in their own community and is being run by First Nations people, right? So I think when we look at education, we really have to focus on education on the land. We have to, yes, the classroom learning has to be there, but it needs to be reinforced with relevant real-life experiences. For another example, we've often taken students out into the maple sugar camps in the spring. So again, here's another enterprise that a lot of First Nations from Wacomican are involved in, and they're actually harvesting the maple syrup, and some of them are making sugar as well. And again, they're bottling it, and they're being part of the, I guess, modern day type of economy, where a lot of folks now tend to eat pancakes and that sort of thing for breakfast, and maple syrup is an important part of that activity, right? So again, we take our students out to the sugar bush. In the past, they used to collect syrup from tree to tree and collect it in a pail. Some of the harvesters, maple sugar makers and syrup makers still do that, but most of them have kind of transformed their enterprise into more modern processes, and they are using hoses and vacuum lines and compressors to kind of bring it into the modern era, so that way you could better harvest the syrup rather than it overflowing to the ground, that sort of thing, right? So again, the students are involved in that, and they're involved in collecting, they're involved in bottling, they're involved in looking at the process, right? So that's a big part of First Nations culture in the past, but it continues to be part of the way we live today. And I think students need to learn how their culture in the past, the way we used to process maple syrup and sugar, and to the way we process it now. And again, looking at the markets, where do you sell your product to, right? So education needs to be, again, I always underscore, it's got to be relevant and engaging. And it's got to be relevant because they have to see it in their own community, and they kind of have to, get hands-on and get that experiential education. So that's kind of what to me, what we looked at as best practice in our education system. And as I indicated earlier, in the past I was a classroom teacher, principal, and education director. And as an education director in the past, I was able to ensure that we use the community and we use the natural environment and we bring it into the classroom, or sometimes we take the classroom out into the environment. And that's something you don't see too much of in the cities, but I think in the smaller communities you do see a lot of it. Same with snowshoeing and cross-country skiing. Again, snowshoeing is, again, part of First Nations culture. So we try to get the students outside, outdoors, especially during gym time, and to partake in outdoor activities to let them know what was part of their culture and what continues to be part of their culture. I wouldn't really use Indigenous too much because I consider myself Odawa, Anishinaabe, and as an Anishinaabe person, that's how I identify myself. Indigenous, I think it's more it's more of a Canadian term, like a pan-Indian term to identify all the Indigenous people in Canada because there's so much nations. It would be difficult for them to use all the nations to describe us. So I guess it's a descriptive for non-native people to describe us. But for myself, I consider myself Anishinaabe, or I consider myself Odawa Anishinaabe. And sometimes I do use the terms First Nations, Métis, and Inuit to describe the people that live in Canada. So Indigenous, anybody could be Indigenous. A Chinese person is Indigenous to China. A German is Indigenous to Germany, right? So Indigenous is a name that could be utilized by anybody. So, but as a First Nations, Métis and Inuit, as a Odawa Anishinaabe, I'm a First Nations person from Canada. So I would Anishinaabe education to me is an education that is positive, education that is vibrant, an education that is filled with culture and filled with histories that are all positive about our people, about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, about Odawa, Anishinaabe people. So Anishinaabe education is about learning about the world around us, learning about the different worldviews, learning about our natural environment, learning about your math, your science, your English in the classroom, but interweaving that with Anishinaabe worldviews. So that to me is Anishinaabe education, and it's got to be positive, and it's got to be vibrant, and it's got to be delivered in such a way where students are going to take pride of who they are. So to me, that's meaningful education, and as well, that's a positive education. So an Anishinaabe education system should encompass that. So again, we're not one homogenous Indigenous group. We're quite diverse. We all have our own languages. We all have our own cultures and ways that we see the world. Of course, the way we see the world centers on Great Lakes here as Anishinaabe. Or if you were to go out to British Columbia, theirs would be centered on the ocean. As an educator for myself in the past, when I worked in Wakwamacon, or if I worked in Peterborough or Toronto, I made sure that education for Anishinaabe students, for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, was positive. It had positive historical narratives. And that's the only way we're going to look at best practices in meaningful ways to correct the way we present that information. And as I indicated earlier, it's got to be relevant. You got to use the community, and you have to use those positive community narratives to really capture the students' desire to want to learn. Because every student that comes in the classroom, they want to learn. So how do we capture their desire to learn? We do it in positive ways and meaningful ways, and we give them positive encouragement. And if we could kind of capture the 7 grandfather teachings as well, and interweave them throughout the day, and I think that's going to make education more meaningful culturally for First Nations people, for Métis people, for Inuit people. It's got to be relevant. If you're a Métis, you want to talk about their Métis historical narratives. You need to talk about Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumas in positive ways, because they were, some of the founding fathers of so-called Canada as well, along with many First Nations leaders, right? And when you want to talk about the Inuit, what have been their contributions? I mean, the kayak and knowing all the intricacies of the far north. I mean, nobody knows that land better than the Inuit or the Innu. So to kind of draw on all those narratives and to bring it into the classroom, that's best practice. That's doing it in meaningful ways, and to reappropriate all that positive knowledge that kind of like the West has taken from us and called it as their own, we need to take it back, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're eating popcorn while we watch a movie. Popcorn is a gift from First Nations people. We go into McDonald's and have a burger and French fries. Well, French fries is a potato. Again, it's an indigenous crop from the Americas, right? So we need to reappropriate all those positive stories, right? Even if you were to look at, my daughter is a medical doctor, a medical practitioner, and when she studied at McMaster, she did her own little research project, right? And what she did hers on was how much of the pharmacopoeia is actually from indigenous America, from the Americas. And she said not no less than 70% of the pharmacopoeia that we have in the pharmacies and the medical field today is from indigenous people. So we need to reappropriate all the positive things, indigenous botany and indigenous thinkers and leaders, utilized in the past. We need to reappropriate that, and we need to reinvigorate our classrooms with that positive story. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've kind of taken that to the next level, where I taught briefly as a professor of Indigenous Studies in a post-secondary setting in Southern Ontario, and right from the daycares, kindergarten, grade 12, post-secondary, we need to follow our students right through the system, and we need to ensure that it's done in positive ways. Whether they're in the daycare and we teach them how to create their own regalia, and to begin to teach them songs on the big drum or the hand drums, it needs to start there, and we need to carry that right through the system, and interweaving it with Anishinaabe language and culture, to always make sure there's time for language, time for culture, and yet cover all those areas and the criteria that the curriculum wants us to follow. My vision, of course, is to ensure that all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit have a positive, meaningful education. That education has to include their language, their culture, their geography, their land, where they come from, their homeland, and then interweave that with modern education. Because at the end of the day, we want our students to be good First Nation citizens, Métis, Inuit citizens, but yet belong as part of Canada. But we need to know those students need to know who they are. So that's my vision for a strong education system. Because whether they want to be, it doesn't matter what field that they want to get into when they're done high school. We want them to be successful. They could shoot, the sky's the limit, whether they want to be an astronaut or a doctor or a lawyer, or if they want to drive trucks for a living. Whatever they decide to want to do, I think our education system should prepare them for that. And we must never forget to incorporate and integrate our Anishinaabe language, our culture, our worldviews into that. But with still having the ability to compete at a high academic level. And studies indicate that students that have a second language or that are bilingual, it develops the brain. The studies indicate that their ability to learn is much quicker, and their ability to, for their brain to grasp knowledge and to become a well-rounded student is better with another language or with another culture. So being bilingual and knowing a second or even third or fourth language is actually a positive thing. Sometimes when we go into the community, people think that if they learn their language, it might hinder their progress in school. But when you look at all the other cultures, even when you go to Quebec or you go to bilingual communities, being bilingual is actually a very positive thing. And it's actually it makes students a lot smarter. So I think we need to ensure that when we teach First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students, that we include their Indigenous language, their Anishinaabe language.